In the scorched deserts of Romania, beneath the ancient soil where empires once clashed and kingdoms fell, lay a liquid treasure that would alter the course of the greatest war humanity had ever known. This is not a tale of heroic soldiers storming beaches or generals making brilliant tactical decisions. This is the story of something far more fundamental, far more essential to victory than any weapon or any army. This is the story of oil, black gold pulled from the earth, refined into aviation fuel, and transformed into the lifeblood of an entire air campaign that would determine whether freedom or tyranny would rule the skies over Europe. Without this single discovery, without the refineries that processed it and the desperate battles fought to control it, the outcome of World War II might have been written in entirely different ink. The roar of 10,000 aircraft engines, the thunder of bombs falling on enemy positions, the protection of Allied soldiers advancing across occupied territories, all of it depended on drops of fuel that began their journey in one remarkable place. This is the story of Ploesti, the oil fields that powered an air war, and the men who fought and died to control the fuel that would decide the fate of nations. Long before the first shots of World War II echoed across Europe, long before anyone understood that modern warfare would be fought as much in the air as on the ground, the oil fields of Ploesti had been quietly producing their precious commodity in the rolling hills north of Bucharest. The discovery of oil in this region during the mid-19th century had transformed Romania from an agricultural backwater into an industrial power, at least by the standards of Eastern Europe. The fields around Ploesti were not the largest in the world. They could not compare to the vast reserves being tapped in Texas or the Middle East, but they possessed something that would prove invaluable in the coming conflict. They were located in Europe itself, accessible by rail and road, positioned in a nation that would soon align itself with the Axis powers, and they contained high-quality crude oil that could be efficiently refined into the high-octane aviation fuel that modern warplanes demanded. By the time Adolf Hitler began his conquest of Europe in 1939, Germany faced a critical vulnerability that threatened to strangle any long-term military ambitions. The Third Reich possessed virtually no natural oil reserves within its borders. Every drop of fuel that powered the Luftwaffe's fighters and bombers, every liter that drove the Panzer tanks across Poland and France, every gallon that kept the German war machine grinding forward, had to be imported or synthesized through expensive and inefficient chemical processes. Hitler and his military planners understood this weakness with crystal clarity. They knew that without a steady supply of petroleum products, their mighty military forces would become nothing more than immobile steel monuments scattered across the European landscape. The Ploesti oil fields, producing hundreds of thousands of barrels every single day, and operating some of the most advanced refineries in Europe, represented a lifeline that Germany absolutely had to control if it wanted any chance of sustaining a prolonged war. As German forces swept across Europe with terrifying speed in the early years of the war, securing access to Romanian oil became a top priority for Hitler's regime. Romania, led by the authoritarian government of Marshal Ion Antonescu, had grown increasingly sympathetic to the Axis cause, both from ideological alignment and from pragmatic recognition that Germany represented the dominant power in the region. In November 1940, Romania formally joined the Axis alliance, and with that decision, the Ploesti oil fields effectively became German property. Engineers and technicians from Germany soon arrived to maximize production and ensure that every possible drop of fuel was extracted, refined, and shipped north to feed the insatiable appetite of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. The refineries at Ploesti worked around the clock, their towers and cracking plants operating at maximum capacity, transforming crude oil into aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, lubricants, and all the petroleum products that mechanized warfare demanded. For the Allied powers watching from Britain and later from America, the significance of Ploesti could not be overstated. Intelligence analysts studying German fuel supplies calculated that these Romanian fields supplied approximately 30% of all petroleum products used by the Axis war machine. Some estimates place the figure even higher for aviation fuel specifically, suggesting that nearly half of all the gasoline that powered Luftwaffe aircraft originated from the refineries clustered around this one Romanian city. If the Allies could somehow destroy or severely damage these facilities, they could potentially cripple German air operations across multiple fronts. Every bomber that could no longer fly, every fighter that remained grounded for lack of fuel, represented Allied soldiers who would not die from aerial attack, Allied ships that would not be sunk by reconnaissance aircraft, Allied positions that would not be strafed by enemy planes. The mathematics of total war were brutally simple: destroy the oil, ground the aircraft, win the war. The first Allied air raid against Ploesti came surprisingly early in the war, long before most people understood just how critical these facilities would become. In June 1942, a small force of American B-24 Liberator bombers launched from bases in Egypt and flew a daring mission across the Mediterranean and deep into Romanian airspace. The raid itself caused minimal damage. The bombers were too few in number and attacking from too great a distance to achieve meaningful results, but it served notice to the Germans that the Allies recognized the importance of these oil fields and were willing to take extreme risks to attack them. More importantly, it provided valuable intelligence about the defenses protecting Ploesti. The German and Romanian forces responded to this initial raid by transforming the area around the refineries into one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe. Anti-aircraft batteries sprouted like deadly mushrooms around every major facility. Barrage balloons floated above the refineries, their cables designed to shred any aircraft flying too low. Fighter squadrons were stationed at nearby airfields with orders to intercept any Allied bombers that dared approach. As the war ground on through 1942 and into 1943, the strategic situation evolved in ways that made Ploesti even more critical. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union had stalled in the frozen hell of the Russian winter. The Africa campaign had turned decisively against the Axis powers. Allied bombers were beginning to pound German cities and industrial centers with increasing regularity. Every one of these developments consumed fuel at an astronomical rate, and more of that fuel was flowing from the Romanian oil fields. German synthetic fuel production struggled to meet demand despite massive investments in coal liquefaction plants. Captured oil fields in the Soviet Union produced far less than German planners had hoped. Ploesti stood as the indispensable source, the one supplier that Germany absolutely could not afford to lose. Allied war planners recognized this dependency and began developing plans for a massive assault that would attempt to destroy the refineries once and for all. On August 1, 1943, 178 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers lifted off from airfields in the Libyan desert and turned their noses northeast toward Romania. The crews flying these aircraft knew they were embarking on one of the most dangerous missions of the entire war. The plan called for them to fly more than 2,000 miles round trip, much of it over enemy territory, to attack the most heavily defended target in Europe at extremely low altitude. The low-level approach was deemed necessary to achieve accuracy and surprise, but it also meant flying directly into the teeth of anti-aircraft defenses that would have point-blank shots at the approaching bombers. Every man climbing into those aircraft understood that many of them would not return. They went anyway, because they believed that destroying Ploesti was worth almost any cost. The mission began to unravel almost from the moment the bombers crossed into Romanian airspace. Navigation errors caused by a combination of bad weather, poor visibility, and the incredible complexity of coordinating such a large formation led to confusion about the exact location of various refinery complexes. Some bomber groups approached their targets from the wrong direction, flying directly over the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses instead of avoiding them as planned. Others arrived at their assigned refineries only to find that previous groups had already attacked, stirring up the defenders into a state of maximum alertness. The German and Romanian gunners poured an unbelievable volume of fire into the sky, and at such low altitudes the bombers had nowhere to hide. Tracers and explosive shells ripped through fuselages and wings. Aircraft burst into flames and cartwheeled into the ground. Bombers collided with barrage balloon cables and disintegrated in mid-air. Some crews, their aircraft fatally damaged but still under control, deliberately aimed their burning planes at refinery towers and cracking plants, turning their bombers into massive guided missiles in a final attempt to destroy their targets. When the surviving bombers finally staggered back to their bases in Libya, the toll was staggering even by the brutal standards of World War II aerial combat. 53 aircraft had been lost, more than a third of the attacking force. Over 600 airmen were dead, captured, or missing. It represented one of the highest loss rates of any American bombing mission during the entire war. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded to participants in the raid, more than any other single action in American military history, testament to the extraordinary courage displayed by crews who pressed home their attacks despite facing near certain death. The immediate reaction among Allied commanders was to question whether the mission had been worth such a terrible price. Had the damage inflicted on the Ploesti refineries justified the sacrifice of so many skilled airmen and irreplaceable heavy bombers? The initial assessment of bomb damage suggested that the raid had achieved significant success. Flames and smoke had engulfed multiple refinery complexes. Towers had toppled, pipelines had ruptured, and storage tanks had exploded in spectacular fireballs. Reconnaissance photographs showed extensive destruction across the target area. However, as subsequent intelligence reports filtered in over the following weeks and months, a more sobering picture emerged. The Germans and Romanians had repaired the damage with remarkable speed, cannibalizing equipment from less critical facilities and working around the clock to restore production. Within weeks, oil was flowing again at nearly pre-raid levels. The refineries had proven far more resilient than Allied planners had anticipated. The equipment could be replaced, the structures could be rebuilt, and production could be restored as long as the crude oil kept flowing from the wells. The heroic sacrifice of Operation Tidal Wave had brought only a temporary reduction in German fuel supplies. The disappointing results of the low-level attack forced Allied strategists to reconsider their approach to neutralizing Ploesti. Rather than attempting another dramatic single raid, they decided on a campaign of sustained bombardment from high altitude, using the heavy bomber forces that were accumulating in Italy following the Allied invasions of Sicily and the Italian mainland. Starting in the spring of 1944 and continuing through August of that year, American 15th Air Force bombers made Ploesti a priority target, launching repeated missions against the refineries whenever weather and tactical conditions permitted. These high-altitude raids lacked the visceral drama of the low-level attack, but they proved far more effective at achieving lasting damage. Wave after wave of B-24s and B-17s dropped thousands of tons of high-explosive bombs on the refinery complexes, systematically destroying the specialized equipment that could not be quickly replaced. The defenders made the American bombers pay dearly for every attack. The anti-aircraft defenses around Ploesti were constantly reinforced and improved. German fighter squadrons intercepted the bomber formations and engaged in desperate battles with the escorting American fighters. Crew losses mounted with each successive raid, yet the bombing continued relentlessly, grinding down the refining capacity piece by piece. By the summer of 1944, oil production from Ploesti had dropped to a fraction of its pre-bombing levels. The Germans still controlled the oil fields themselves. Crude oil still flowed from the wells, but without functioning refineries to transform that crude into usable aviation fuel and other products, the raw petroleum was nearly worthless. German synthetic fuel plants struggled to compensate for the shortfall, but they could not possibly replace the enormous output that Ploesti had once provided. while American bombers were systematically destroying the refineries from the air. Events on the ground were moving toward a conclusion that would make the entire question of Plosty's productive capacity irrelevant to German war plans. Soviet forces, having turned the tide on the Eastern Front and begun their inexorable advance westward, were pushing through Ukraine and into the Balkans. Romania, reading the strategic situation with increasing clarity and understanding that Germany was losing the war, began to waver in its commitment to the Axis cause. On August 23, 1944, Romania executed a dramatic reversal, overthrowing the Antonescu government, switching sides to join the Allies, and declaring war on Germany. Soviet troops poured into Romania and quickly occupied the Plosti region. The oil fields and refineries, or what remained of them after months of American bombing, fell into Soviet hands without a fight. For Germany, the loss of Plosti represented a catastrophic blow from which there would be no recovery. The Luftwaffe, already struggling with pilot losses and aircraft attrition, now faced severe fuel shortages that grounded increasingly large portions of its fighter and bomber forces. Newly manufactured aircraft sat idle at factories for lack of fuel to fly them to operational units. Fighter pilots trained for months on the most advanced tactics received only minimal flight time because fuel had to be husbanded for actual combat operations. The vaunted German panzer divisions that had once raced across Europe found themselves increasingly immobilized, their tanks dug in as stationary defensive positions because there was no fuel to maneuver them. The grand strategic mobility that had defined German military operations in the early years of the war evaporated as the fuel supplies dried up. Every military operation had to be carefully calculated against available fuel stocks. Offensives that might have disrupted Allied advances had to be canceled or scaled back. Defensive positions could not be reinforced because moving troops and equipment consumed too much precious gasoline. The destruction of Plosti's productive capacity and the subsequent capture of the oil fields by Soviet forces marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. Allied commanders had long understood that air superiority was essential to the success of ground operations, but they had struggled against a Luftwaffe that, even when outnumbered, could concentrate forces at critical points and contest control of the skies. The fuel crisis changed this equation fundamentally. By late 1944 and into 1945, German fighter opposition began to decline precipitously. Luftwaffe units that had once launched dozens of fighters to intercept Allied bomber formations could now barely scrape together a handful of aircraft with enough fuel to take off. Allied bombers ranged across German-controlled territory with increasing impunity, striking industrial targets, transportation networks, and military installations without facing the murderous fighter opposition that had characterized earlier campaigns. The impact on ground operations was equally profound. Allied forces advancing through France and into Germany itself enjoyed air cover that was virtually uncontested. German troops moving in daylight were subjected to devastating attacks by Allied fighter bombers that could loiter over the battlefield for extended periods without fear of being driven off by German fighters. Supply columns, troop concentrations, headquarters elements, artillery positions, all became easy prey for aircraft that could search methodically for targets without having to worry about aerial opposition. The tactical air support that Allied armies received accelerated their advance and reduced their casualties. Soldiers on the ground who might otherwise have been killed by German air attacks survived because those attacks never came. The absence of German aircraft from the skies over the battlefield was as significant as the presence of Allied planes, and both conditions stemmed directly from the fuel crisis that the destruction of Plosti had precipitated. The strategic consequences of losing Romanian oil production radiated outward from the immediate military situation and affected German operations across every theater of the war. In the Atlantic, German submarines that had terrorized Allied shipping for years found their operations increasingly constrained by fuel shortages. U-boats had to remain in port for extended periods or conduct abbreviated patrols that reduced their effectiveness. Training programs for new submarine crews were curtailed because fuel could not be wasted on exercises. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had hung in the balance for so long, tilted decisively toward the Allies as German naval operations withered for lack of petroleum products. In the Mediterranean, German and Italian naval forces essentially ceased to exist as effective fighting organizations, their ships confined to port and serving as little more than floating anti-aircraft batteries, because there was no fuel to sortie them. On the Eastern Front, where the decisive battles of the European War were being fought, the fuel crisis contributed to the collapse of German defensive lines across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Soviet offensives that might have been blunted by mobile reserves and armored counterattacks instead rolled over German positions that lacked the fuel to maneuver. The brilliant defensive tactics that German commanders had developed through years of hard experience became impossible to execute when their forces were chained to fixed positions by empty fuel tanks. Soviet tank armies exploited breakthrough after breakthrough, racing deep into the German rear areas while German armored divisions that should have been counterattacking remained motionless for want of gasoline. The entire character of the war in the East changed as German forces transitioned from a mobile defense to a static one, and that transition was driven as much by the fuel crisis as by any other single factor. Behind the cold strategic calculations and the statistics about fuel production and bombing tonnage lay thousands of individual human stories, each one a tragedy or a triumph, each one representing a life forever changed by the struggle for Plosty's oil. The American airmen who died during Operation Tidal Wave and the subsequent bombing campaigns left behind families who mourned their loss and wondered whether the sacrifice had been worthwhile. The Romanian workers who perished in the bombing raids, civilians whose only crime was working at a refinery that had become a military target, represented the moral complexity of strategic bombing campaigns that made no distinction between soldiers and those who supported them. The German pilots who died because their fuel-starved fighter aircraft could not climb high enough to intercept Allied bombers, or who crashed during landing approaches because their tanks ran dry, paid the price for their nation's strategic dependency on a vulnerable resource located far from their borders. Yet the human cost must be measured against the human cost that was prevented. Every Allied soldier who survived the war because German aircraft could not attack his position, every sailor who made it home because submarines could not patrol the shipping lanes, every civilian who lived because Luftwaffe bombers lacked the fuel to reach their city, all of them benefited from the destruction of Plosti, even if they never knew it. The strategic vision of Allied planners who identified oil as a critical vulnerability and who committed enormous resources to exploiting that weakness proved sound. Wars are won not just through courage and tactical skill, though both are essential, but through the unglamorous work of logistics and resource management. The side that can keep its forces supplied, fueled, and equipped will ultimately prevail over an enemy that cannot, regardless of the bravery of individual soldiers or the brilliance of individual generals. In the final months of the war, as Allied and Soviet forces closed in on Germany from all directions, the ruins of Plosti stood as a monument to the power of strategic bombing and the importance of petroleum in modern warfare. The once mighty refineries that had processed millions of barrels of crude oil were now skeletal frameworks of twisted steel and shattered concrete. The wells still produced oil. The geological formations beneath the Romanian earth still contained their ancient stores of compressed organic matter. But without refineries to transform crude into usable products, that oil served no military purpose. Soviet engineers examined the facilities and began planning for their eventual reconstruction, but that was a peacetime concern. For the purposes of World War II, Ploesti had been neutralized. Its contribution to the Axis war effort terminated as effectively as if the wells themselves had run dry. The contrast between Ploesti's condition at the war's end and its status at the beginning of the conflict illustrated the totality of the transformation that the bombing campaigns had achieved. In 1939, this had been one of Europe's most productive and sophisticated petroleum processing centers, a gleaming example of industrial might and technological achievement. By 1945, it was a wasteland of rubble and ruin, valuable only for the scrap metal that could be salvaged from its wreckage. The journey from one state to the other had consumed years of planning, thousands of tons of bombs, hundreds of aircraft, and numerous lives, but it had achieved the strategic objective of denying Germany access to fuel supplies that were essential to sustaining its military operations. The oil fields of Ploesti had indeed powered an air campaign, but not in the way that Hitler and his generals had envisioned. They had powered the Allied air campaign by serving as a target whose destruction crippled the Luftwaffe and enabled Allied air forces to dominate the skies. The story of Ploesti resonated far beyond the immediate context of World War II and established principles that would shape military thinking for generations to come. The campaign demonstrated beyond any doubt that modern mechanized warfare was absolutely dependent on petroleum products, and that military forces cut off from fuel supplies would cease to function regardless of their numerical strength or technical sophistication. This lesson influenced Cold War military planning on both sides of the Iron Curtain. American and NATO strategists developed extensive plans for interdicting Soviet oil supplies in the event of a European conflict. Soviet military doctrine placed enormous emphasis on securing fuel supplies and protecting petroleum infrastructure from enemy attack. The vulnerability of oil facilities to aerial bombardment became a fundamental assumption of strategic planning. The specific tactics and technologies employed in the Ploesti raids also left lasting legacies. The low-level attack techniques pioneered during Operation Tidal Wave influenced the development of specialized strike aircraft designed to penetrate enemy defenses at extremely low altitudes. The sustained high-altitude bombing campaign that followed demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic attacks against industrial targets when continued over an extended period. Intelligence analysts studying the Ploesti operations learned valuable lessons about assessing bomb damage and understanding the resilience of industrial facilities, lessons that proved applicable to targeting decisions throughout the remainder of the war and in subsequent conflicts. The simple fact that Allied commanders were willing to accept heavy losses in order to attack oil infrastructure signaled to future adversaries that petroleum facilities would always be considered high-value targets in any major conflict. The story of Ploesti and its role in World War II serves as a powerful reminder that wars are won through the interaction of countless factors, many of them far removed from the drama of battlefield combat. The soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy and fought their way across France could not have succeeded without fuel for their vehicles and air support from planes that required gasoline. The sailors who protected the Atlantic convoy routes depended on the absence of German aircraft that would have attacked them if fuel had been available to the Luftwaffe. The prisoners who survived concentration camps because Allied armies liberated them in time owed their lives in part to the fuel shortage that prevented German forces from organizing more effective resistance. All of these outcomes trace back, at least partially, to the oil fields of Romania and the determined effort to destroy the refineries that processed their production. One oil discovery, made in the 19th century by engineers who could never have imagined the uses to which their find would be put, truly did power an entire air campaign. It powered the Luftwaffe in the early years of the war when German forces seemed invincible. It became the target of one of the most heroic and costly bombing raids in American military history. It sustained months of systematic bombardment that turned it from an asset into a liability. And in its destruction, it powered the Allied air campaign by removing the fuel that might have kept German aircraft aloft and German tanks mobile. The refineries of Ploesti were never going to win the war for Germany. Too many other factors worked against Axis victory. But their loss certainly accelerated Germany's defeat and saved countless Allied lives in the process. The men who planned the attacks, who flew the missions, who dropped the bombs, and who died in the attempt understood that they were fighting for something larger than any individual battle or any single target. They were fighting to end a war that had consumed the world in flames. They were fighting to defeat an ideology of hatred and conquest. And they were fighting, whether they fully understood it or not, to control the resources that made modern warfare possible. The oil beneath Ploesti was neither good nor evil. It was simply a resource, but the struggle to control it became one of the defining campaigns of the Second World War. In the end, the side that could deny its enemy access to fuel while maintaining its own supplies emerged victorious, and that victory was built on the ruins of Romanian refineries and the sacrifice of airmen who understood that some targets were worth any cost to destroy. Their story endures as testament to the strategic importance of resources, the power of air campaigns, and the courage of those who fight wars not with rifles and bayonets, but with bombs and determination, striking at the industrial heart of enemy power and accepting terrible losses in pursuit of ultimate victory.